Thanks everybody for joining. I think we're at critical mass now. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Doug Lewin. I am president, founder of Stoic Energy. I also now have to start introducing myself as the host of the Texas Power Podcast. I keep forgetting to do that, but I do now host a podcast and I hope you'll check it out. Very excited for y'all to be with us today. This is a very important webinar with some a great study and some very important findings. Before I introduce our panelists and before we jump in, let me just say we will use the Q&A for interacting with the audience today. Try to avoid using the chat if you can. We like to do that so we can just answer the questions directly in the Q&A if they're clarifying questions. If they're more substantive questions, we won't try to answer them in text. We'll take them in the back half of this call. So the way that this will work is we will have some very brief presentations in the first 30 minutes. And then in the second half of the hour, we'll take your questions. Please don't wait till the end of the half hour to put those questions in. Put them in as you have them, as you're hearing the content and as you think of them, so that we can be sure to make sure that we're able to answer them. All right, so what we're talking about today, and I'll introduce our panelists in just a minute here, is the true cost of the ERCOT market changes that have been proposed. So just to quickly level set on where we are, as is lost on exactly no one. Obviously, Winter Storm Uri happened in February 2021. It was a catastrophic event with significant loss of life and property damage, and was really obviously changed everything as far as power markets in Texas go. So there obviously was legislation passed during the legislative session. The entire Public Utility Commission was replaced. The entire ERCOT board was replaced. And there were some pretty substantive changes, and we will talk about those during this call. There were some substantive changes made to the market, particularly to the operating reserve demand curve and to emergency response service. We'll get into some of that, some of what is called at the PUC phase one. At the end of last year, December 2021, the PUC adopted a memo that put in place those phase one changes and also put forward what are called phase two changes. Those phase two changes are being considered right now, and those are really the focus of this webinar today. So what we're going to talk about is a study and analysis that was done by ICF that looks at both the reliability impacts of each of those phase two changes and of the phase one changes that have already been made. Looks at the reliability impact and the cost impact, both. So some really interesting findings here, some things that are really, I think, going to help stakeholders and policymakers and the general public understand what's going on and understand these options that are before the state of Texas at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists in the order that they're going to appear today. We have Allison Silverstein. She's a former Public Utility Commission and Federal Energy Regulatory Commission senior advisor. She's an energy consultant and author and strategist. And she is a consultant to the Texas Consumer Association, which has commissioned this study and is hosting the webinar today. Our second panelist is going to be Pat Milligan. He is the ICF report lead. He is the senior manager for energy power markets at ICF International, and we're really glad to have him with us today. Thanks for being with us, Pat. Last but certainly not least, known to many of you is Dr. Joshua Rhodes from here in Texas, and he is the Chief Technology Officer at IdeaSmiths. He's also a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin, but is here today in his capacity as Chief Technology Officer for IdeaSmiths. So this is a great panel. They've got some really meaty information to share with you. So I will get out of the way. I will turn it over to Allison to take it from here. And again, please put those questions into the Q&A. And we will take the specific ones as we go, and then the more substantive ones in the back half hour. Allison, over to you.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be working with the Texas Consumer Association. TCA is a nonprofit working on pocketbook issues. with the interests of residential and small business consumers consistently in hand. And TCA works on these, advocates for these concerns in front of regulatory and legislative issues. TCA funded this study because, as many of you who are on this call know, it's been very difficult to get solid information from the PUC and ERCOT about the actual costs of what we are already seeing happening in the ERCOT market, and about the likely costs and reliability impacts of the market changes that we are seeing. So TCA got tired of waiting for other people to do studies or to change their minds about how much information to share, and commissioned this piece of work with ICF Incorporated. ICF is an internationally respected economic consulting firm that has been working on regional market issues and electric wholesale markets for many years. It's been a great pleasure working with Pat Milligan and the great ICF team on this project. And I think you will be as impressed as I am by the findings that we have to share with you today. Next slide, please, Sarah. To my mind, and for TCA, there are really 5 principal findings. With the phase 1 ERCOT changes we've already seen today, reliability has improved. As many of you know, winterization of power plants is the principal reason for better reliability today. Assuming that we have fuel delivery winterized to the same degree that power plants are, we probably have significantly better reliability for winter in particular. But for the improvement with phase 1 changes are, frankly, that we could still have as many as 5 outages over 10 years, which is well short of industry goals. Industry goals are more like only 1 outage the probability of 1 outage in 10 years. And that is 5 outages, a whole lot higher than that. Those are more likely to be in winter than in summer. But let's face it, when you're in Texas, no outage is a good time. The phase 1 ERCOT changes to date are likely increasing wholesale costs by over about $1 billion a year across the ERCOT market. And this is an important moment for me to remind you all that we are only going to talk today about wholesale costs, not retail costs. Retail bills are significantly higher in Texas than wholesale costs alone. These include the charges from Winter Storm Uri, transmission and delivery charges, retailer markup, and their hedging and acquisition costs, and a whole lot of other things. We are not talking about the entire retail bill. We are only talking today about wholesale cost increases, which is the thing that all of the PUC's market changes are addressing. Second, all of the phase 2 proposals that we are looking at today that the PUC has proposed, none of them will improve reliability enough to get to 1 in 10 years in terms of outages. So there's a lot of work left to be done to figure out reliability, and I will tell you that this is phase 1 of a 2-part study. We will be releasing a second piece of our study in a few weeks, and that will look at the opportunity or proposal that the PUC is not yet addressing, and that is, what if we were trying to address reliability by doing a lot more aggressive energy efficiency and demand response? If we did that in order to protect both consumer affordability and consumer reliability from grid failure, what would that mean for the burden of reliability that the ERCOT grid has to face and the problems that ERCOT and the PUC have to solve? We do not answer that question in this study. This study, what you are going to hear about today, is purely about the phase 1 and the phase 2 changes, but we will be sharing the next set of results with you in about 3 weeks. The PUC is looking at 3 principal options in phase 2. The DEC proposal means dispatchable energy credits. It is similar to the concept of renewable energy credits, except this goes to fast, flexible resources and pays each megawatt hour generated in that by a fast, flexible resource that is specifically defined for its performance capabilities. The DEC proposal will pay a small premium to each DEC generated. The DEC proposal, we find through the ICF modeling, will improve reliability, particularly in summer, and it will grow more resources online. that should improve reliability. The cost of that will be about $1.3 billion per year in 2023 and 2025. But pretty soon there will be enough resources online that we will actually end up as customers in ERCOT spending less money because we have a more efficient market with greater reliability, because these additional resources that the DEC proposal could bring online on top of the phase one additional generation will in fact save customers money relative to the phase one additional costs. The phase two backstop reliability service recommendation would move old generating units in ERCOT that are ready for retirement into emergency operation status. So they would no longer be competing in the wholesale market day to day. The BRS proposal should, we think, improve winter reliability with about a modest 2% cost increase over the phase one. The LSEO, or Load Serving Entity Obligation proposal, is the third proposal, and it would offer minimum reliability improvement relative to phase one. However, ICF's calculations estimate that the LSEO proposal will collect billions of additional dollars from ratepayers. Excuse me, we're not ratepayers anymore, we're customers. And we think this could take as much as $8.5 billion more in 2025 alone that will be paid to existing generators without causing much significant new capacity build or predictable reliability improvements, even over the 2023 to 2030 timeframe that we are looking at in this study. So next slide, please. Here is why this is all important to TCA and what prompted us to do this study. Texans needed reliable grid, but not at any cost. And the variations between the proposals at hand today are extraordinarily large, and the amount of reliability that they will deserve is also quite variable, as is the cost magnitude of each of those programs. Energy affordability is also already a critical problem in Texas. Retail electric costs, as you all well know, are up 50 to 70% this year alone. And 1/3 of Texans are low income and energy insecure, which means that they are already having problems paying their electric bills and the bill increases that we've already seen. So having even more hugely expensive programs brought onto decided on by Texas regulators and legislators, we may not be able to afford the cost of these programs, and it is not clear to us that every grid reliability solution has equal value if it breaks our wallets before it can fix the grid. And it's not clear that any of the options recommended will unilaterally fix the grid or fix it with a highly cost-effective solution. So our goal in producing this study is to help regulators and legislators and all of us who are customers of the ERCOT grid get the maximum value from our reliability investments by understanding a sound, transparent analysis of the available options. And Pat and his team at ICF have done such analysis, and we're really proud of the work that they have produced. Pat, why don't you go ahead and talk about your findings? Next slide, Sarah, please.
Allison, if I could just real quick before we turn it over to Pat, I first want to echo the amazing work Pat has done here and just say by way of introduction here, Pat, that you're going to see 5 slides here. The report is really a rich resource, and I hope people will dive into it. There is so much more, and I know Pat agonized over which things to include here and which not. I just want to really quickly also just address a couple of the questions, and Pat, ask you to do the same. So there was a question, does this mean a total blackout of the grid when you say outage? The answer to that is no. The next question that followed is a little more nuanced, does this mean a blackout or load shed or specific outage? And Pat, because this is the first slide you have with LOLE, perhaps you can talk about that. There are different ways to measure this without getting too deep into the weeds. We can do more of that in the back half if folks still want to, but if you could kind of address that a little bit, how in the industry, folks like yourself at ICF and other firms that do these kinds of analyses think about that question of total blackout or number of hours or number of outages and things like that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pat. He's got some great information, and thanks for being with us, Pat.
Okay, great. Thanks, Doug. So a lot of data came out of this study, and I've tried to pick just a couple of charts here, and I will try to keep my comments brief. Otherwise, I'll be talking for 5 hours. So let me start with some of the questions you just asked, Doug, and this is good to clarify. So Eleanor, by outage, has asked, by outage, do you mean a total blackout? No. In this, we are concerned mainly with rotating outages, basically consumers involuntarily losing power. ERCOT basically will cut off consumers to preserve the power grid from having a total failure if there's a shortage of resources. So it's a painful solution, but it prevents a total disaster. So we haven't looked at scenarios where there's a complete and total outage and the entire grid goes dark. The next question there is does outage refer to a specific power plant? And I'm glad this was asked too. So outage is unfortunately a term that gets thrown around. So if I ever say outage to mean a forced outage at a power plant, I will try to be clear about that. But for the most part, what I'm referring to again is rotating outages implemented by ERCOT to preserve the grid during an emergency. So for purposes, I'll try to be very clear about this for the next hour here. Outage just means involuntary load shed.
And so it's one, or it's a few customers. It's not a grid-wide collapse.
It's not everybody. Yeah, it's not a total collapse. Correct.
And there are multiple terms for outages. We will sometimes be talking about an event, which is what loss of load expectation is. But in other cases, Pat will talk about expected unserved energy, which is number of hours that many customers are out. And so it's like hours times customers out of service. There are many different outage metrics, which is why this is so complicated.
Right. Thanks, Allison. So I want to just talk about this first chart here, because this is the bottom line with respect to reliability. This chart best summarizes the reliability impacts of the 5 different cases that we studied. So the dark blue line on top, well, let me start by, so on the y-axis here, what you're seeing is loss of load expectation. That's what LOLE stands for. And that is the expected number of days in a year where the grid has an outage, where consumers, some consumers will lose load. And the bottom, there's a dashed green line on the bottom there at 0.1. And so that represents basically on average 1 day every 10 years, you will have an outage. And that's a common target. Most reliability planners use that as a reference level for reliability should be at least that good. So it's an inverted axis. If LOLE is lower than 0.1, that means high reliability. And high LOLE means low reliability. That means you're having more frequent outages than ideal. So the dark blue line there is phase 0. So this is this market no longer exists. This was prior changes. And then you'll see the orange line just below that. It's overlapped by some other colors there in the first years. So this is reliability improvements achieved, as Allison and Doug mentioned, in phase 1 by the rules changes that have already been made. And then we have the 3 phase 2 options, which is the LSEO, DEC, DEC, and BRS down below that. So all of them achieve reliability improvements compared to phase 1. The DEC and LSEO achieve sort of modest reliability improvements, and the BRS achieves greater reliability improvements, and I'll get into why that is on the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. Okay. So this slide here shows new resource additions to the ERCOT grid between now and 2030. This is cumulative. So here on the left chart shows phase 1. So under the current market structure, we would forecast a pretty large amount of solar in the yellow bar and storage in the purple bar on top there to come online anyway in the next 7 years. The reason I'm showing these bars here is phase 2 proposals are trying to improve reliability by changing the supply stack, by changing the resources available to ERCOT to serve load. So mainly we would forecast without any changes, a lot of solar and storage, but also some amount of gas peaking and some amount of wind. So then the 3 bars on the left compare to phase 1. So under the LSEO, we forecast an additional 2.5 gigawatts of gas peaking generation by 2030. We can get into the details of why that is, but there's basically a range of outcomes in this program depending on how they set it up. I have a slide on that later, and under what we think is the most likely case, it has a relatively modest impact and will bring on some new generation, and the additional 2.5 gigawatts of gas is what results in the reliability improvements shown on the previous slide. The DEC brings online a roughly similar amount of capacity, but instead of gas, it's 2-hour battery. That's one of the technologies specifically highlighted by the DEC proposal to receive extra credits, extra payments. And so we forecast about 3 gigawatts of additional entry from that program. And then finally, the backstop reliability service is intended to prevent retirements from actually going offline and no longer being available to the grid. And in phase 1, we forecast about 8 gigawatts of retirements between now and 2030. So all of those would be preserved under the backstop reliability service program. So this is why the backstop reliability service achieves greater reliability gains, because basically you have a larger quantity of capacity here that's preserved as compared to phase 1. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the reliability side. Here are the cost impacts. So the graph on the left shows total wholesale costs. Like Allison mentioned, this is energy, ancillary services, and the various costs of phase 2 programs. It doesn't include things like transmission, distribution. And then the graph on the right is the same data, but it's incremental costs just for the phase 2 programs compared to phase 1. So what you see is, as Allison mentioned, the LSEO is projected to be the most expensive of the phase 2 options. And that's because of it basically will create a resource adequacy market, which will be an additional payment stream for all generators to varying degrees. And the costs of that are forecasted to be high, especially in the first couple of years of implementation, which we've assumed in this study to be 2025 through 27. It could be 26 through 28, and the results I don't think would be significantly different. But the way we set it up, the first several years of implementation, the grid is close to a shortage condition, and that leads to very high costs for RA. So the gray bars there, and I'm mostly referring to the chart on the right here because you can see the differences in costs more clearly. So the gray bars represent the DEC program. And as Allison mentioned, the DEC has some cost to consumers of roughly $1 billion per year in the first couple of years. The DEC would take effect immediately, starting in 2023. And then by the end of our study in 2027 through 2030, the cost impact would be negative to consumers because the cost of DEC credits that's getting paid out to those generators who qualify is more than offset by their effect of lowering basically market energy and ancillary prices. So there's a net cost savings. And then finally, the backstop reliability service in the yellow bars there has a relatively modest cost compared to either of those. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide basically summarizes the cost effectiveness of each of the programs. So this is cost per megawatt hour of lost load reduced. So let me break that apart for a second. So under phase 1, we forecast a certain expected amount of megawatt hours that are shed involuntarily. So there's some nuances here that are different than the reliability metrics I showed earlier. So LOLE refers to the number of times that the grid that ERCOT has to shed load, but it doesn't refer to the depth of load shed. And that was a major problem during URI, was not only were outages occurring for a long time, but a lot of the load had to be shed, not just a little bit. And that makes a pretty big difference to the impacts to the state. So we forecasted a certain amount of load shed under phase 1, and then each of these phase 2 programs would improve on that. And so the amount of improvement here is compared to the cost of the program. And what you see here is that the LSEO has the highest costs per improvement achieved. The DEC, as mentioned, has net cost savings, and then the BRS has quite low costs and achieves the greatest amount of megawatt hours saved. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a complicated slide. I'm going to just go over this very quickly, and if there's questions, let's go back to it later. The one thing I want to point out about the LSEO, and this is, I've included this slide because I think it's one of the most important findings in the study, is that the impacts are very uncertain. The proposal, which describes the LSEO, is long, but it is actually lacking in some critical details that have a massive impact on the results of the program. The biggest missing detail is how resources are going to get credited for their basically capacity value. That's basically the LSEO will set up a market where there has to be every resource will get a certain amount of credit. Loads will have to contract to cover themselves for their expected quantity of load. But how credits are assigned can vary significantly. Other markets in the US have capacity crediting systems, but their methodology differs. And as a result, the outcomes would differ. So all I want you to take away from this slide is that on the left here, what's shown is reserve margin, which is sort of the bottom line of the LSEO program. And there's a very wide range of possible reserve margins depending on how you count and credit the resources. And then the chart on the right shows that that range would lead to a very wide range of possible costs of the program. And in the worst case, if the grid is very, very short, you could have penalty prices, which are quite high in the program. And so the total cost impact in the first year could be as high as $30 billion. Let me stop there. I think that's the end of my slides. I'll turn it back to Doug.
Thanks, Pat.
Doug, can I offer a couple of tweaks and additions and expansions on Pat's comments before we go to Josh, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. The first thing I want to do while we have this slide on the screen is remind everybody that just a reserve margin does not guarantee reliability. And we can have very different reserve margins and yet have significantly different loss of load probabilities and number of outage events and different levels of expected unserved energy for customers affected by outages, even in a super high reserve margin. Remember, for instance, that during Winter Storm Uri, we had as much as a 40% reserve margin of capacity online in ERCOT over the ERCOT load forecast, and we still ended up with 20 million people out of power. So reserve margin is not a guarantee of reliability. The second thing I want to do is make sure you all, and we go into that in more detail in the report. The other thing I want to do is lift the hood a little in terms of the methodology that ICF used to do all this analysis and reach these results. It is really easy to do a simple reliability analysis and say, here's the math for your reserve margin over demand based on historic weather. We're done. Here's the numbers and here's how reliable it's going to be. Rather than doing that simple thing, what ICF did was to construct 1,000 different cases using the same resource information, the same resource cost and economics information, natural gas costs, ERCOT population growth and demand levels, et cetera, and a bunch of forward-looking weather scenarios, including a variety of extreme events, and a variety of ERCOT demand forecast error numbers, and a variety of generator outage performance possibilities, and combined those different factors in 1,000 different forward-looking cases. And then they froze that set of 1,000 cases and used the same set of cases to analyze every single one of these scenarios in future years. So essentially you've got 7 years worth of 1,000 cases, and you run the policy scenarios through an identical set. And then all of what you see in this report is the averaging of all of those 1,000 cases results to get to what does this look like in the future. So underlying behind all of the numbers that you see here in terms of costs are really a rich set of ranges of cost, ranges of probability, and the like with respect to outage statistics, with respect to expected undisturbed energy statistics, with respect to how much these alternatives are going to cost us as ERCOT customers in the wholesale market. The report summarizes and shows some of those scatter plots and ranges of outcomes, but we thought that would be even more hard for you to get, for us to get. It's been a lot of head scratching to figure out how to explain this. So what you are seeing here is purely the summary material, and you need to understand that there's a lot of risk and uncertainty and wide variations buried behind and embedded in every one of the average numbers that you see here, which probably that statement just laid the groundwork for Josh to show us.
It does.
Explain that better.
It does. And I want to, just first of all, thank you, Allison, because it is great for folks to understand kind of under the hood what is going on and how complicated all this is. So Josh, I know, so Josh and Allison both helped as this thing went through, looking at those very complicated models and what the results were. So Josh can talk more about that, and I know Josh wants to talk some about the uncertainties that are part of this, and sort of what we use a study like this for to kind of suggest some ways forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh to do that. Josh, I also want to just highlight from the Q&A. There was a great question that came in that I think would be great for you to answer after what everybody's just heard. Can you kind of explain the 3 main proposals in a way that you're going to explain it to a family member who's not in the power industry, or a really smart, 8th grader or whatever? Like, try to bring this to a point where folks can kind of get their heads around what the load serving entity obligation, the backstop reliability service, and the dispatchable energy credit is, and I'm happy to help fill in some gaps. But if you take a stab at that in addition to what else you were going to say, I'd appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Joshua Rhodes.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure being an advisor on this report and seeing it kind of go through and seeing all the rigor that went into it. Yeah, so I'll start with kind of trying to explain each of the phase 2 scenarios. And the LSEO load serving entity obligation is the hardest one to explain. One, for the fact that there's not as much information available about it, but essentially requires those that are serving load to buy capacity in a 3-year kind of forward approach. And so, but whether or not they need to, or how they or how much, really depends on how, as Pat said, how each of the resources that currently exist and are coming online are accredited in reaching that kind of reserve margin. If we credit things to a point where we have no reserve margin issues, then maybe the costs are minimal, we don't need anything. But as you can see, kind of as the chart that shows on the left that's still on the screen, if we have one of those low lines, if we have one of those low lines such that the reserve margin is low, then prices could be very high, and it just makes it, the unknownness about it makes it hard to know which one of these lines would actually be the case. And in fact, when we do these types of analyses, we're not necessarily doing what we call projections, we're doing scenarios, because the future is uncertain. And so that happens to be and that's why we did, the 1,000 simulations of different types of future and different outage rates and all these other kinds of things, is because you want to try to, create a band of, possible futures. And that can be frustrating for people who just want to know what the answer is. But, it's hard to know exactly how things will be, what the weather is going to be in 2027 versus 2030 and all of these, types of other things. So we have to do this kind of scenario approach where we figure out, how the grid will operate, and also then how much things will cost. But that is one of the problems kind of with the LSEO option, is we don't exactly know how things will be counted. And so it's hard to do. We have a pretty wide uncertainty about the cost, because we don't have clarification on how things will be counted. And so, but the idea is that there would be more money going to generators to such that, we would have more reliability going forward. The dispatchable energy credits, the other one, the DEC, and there's a question in about if we have acronyms, and we will define those acronyms. So sorry about that. But the dispatchable energy credits is a program that would pay certain types of generators that meet certain types of qualifications, kind of an extra payment for generating energy in the market. And so it's a program that is trying to incentivize a certain type of generation asset, something essentially very efficient natural gas turbines or batteries to come online to be available for certain parts of the system. What that also will do, and one of the reasons why the cost kind of went negative a little bit, is it will impact overall market operations. So if we have more these power plants kind of online, they will be serving to change, market prices and things like that. The last one, the BRS, the Backstop Reliability Service, this is then kind of the Berkshire Hathaway, the Starwood proposal, and some of the other things that kind of came out initially kind of after Winter Storm Uri. Those were proposals to build a set of entirely new power plants that would sit on the sidelines and it's kind of a break glass to stop emergency type situation. The way this one works is it stops power plants that are expected to retire. It stops them from retiring and kind of places them in a situation, in a place, and it compensates them such that they'll be able to operate, should we get into a grid emergency. But it essentially leaves most of the grid, kind of the competitive nature of the ERCOT market, kind of to operate as it does. So scarcity pricing still forms. We're still matching supply and demand, and those power plants only operate, if we get into a situation, if we find ourselves in kind of an emergency situation. So they're not changing the day-to-day economics of what's on the system, but they would change our reserve margin levels and basically be there just in case we needed them. And this is different because it's existing power plants expected to retire, so they're already in the ground. Steel's already in the ground. We just kind of have them around for a while. So those are kind of the three programs. Hopefully that was helpful. Happy to talk about it more. But yeah, and I'm excited about this work and kind of how it can help move the conversation forward, because in Texas, we need a reliable grid.
Hey, Josh, just real quick too, before we go to questions that have come in, can you do just a minute or two on the report, I believe came out last week, about economic impacts of renewables in ERCOT?
Yeah, so my firm, Data Smith, released a report last week as well, kind of looking at the kind of the economic impacts of what renewables and kind of in the ERCOT market, and how they have influenced wholesale market cost. And one of the things we found since 2010, renewables have reduced wholesale market costs by approximately $28 billion. A lot of that has been in the last year or so, and particularly this year, with natural gas and coal prices being high. We found renewables act as a hedge against high fuel prices. Roughly about $925 million a month is what they've saved from the beginning of the year through August. And so it's a pretty significant amount of money saved, because we're not having to buy as much natural gas and coal that are right now very, very high. And if you add in other things like reduced health impacts from, emissions, the numbers, go up into the high tens of billions, up to 100 billion, depending on what you're looking at. We also looked at water and all these other kinds of things because water is, a scarce resource in the state.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, that was great. And yes, I understand the confusion with the acronyms. If anybody has a question on acronyms, put them in the Q&A. You will see in the report, they're all obviously spelled out, and we do, ICF does explain them there. I don't think there's any place where an acronym would be unexplained. And if you find one, definitely let Pat know and he'll get that fixed. Pat, the first question's for you. If you could take this one kind of quickly. Question from Bob Seckler about the 8.5 billion. Could you put that in terms of percentage of cost?
Yeah, so that 8.5 billion number is forecast for 2025, and that represents a 35% increase in wholesale market costs.
And to be clear, just to put a finer point on it, that is in 1 year. The number was, I believe, 22 point something, Pat, over the 6-year period.
That's correct. Yeah, 2025 to 2030, it's about 22 or 23 billion. Yeah, in total.
So that would be a smaller percentage, but obviously is still a very, very large percentage increase, particularly for the low reliability benefit that was found there.
And
Yeah.
that is an increase in 2025 alone, that 8.5 billion, and that would represent sort of the start of the imposition of the LSCO system methodology, and a massive increase in costs of 35% on wholesale power costs in a single year. If the PUC delays implementation, it could be 2026 instead of 2025. At the end of this report, ICF does offer a series of recommendations about how to better structure and protect customers for each of these proposals. So I encourage you all to look at the recommendations section of the report. And at some point, we will pop up the slide that shows the link to the report, and you will get that in the material. So maybe you want to put that slide up right now, Sarah, please. Slide 11.
And while that is coming up on the screen, there was a question. I think this one probably is also Pat. Do you mean, I think you sort of addressed this, but maybe not fully, this LOLE, loss of load expectation, do you mean 1 hour or 12 hours? I think the answer, right, is it's just number of outages. It doesn't have to do with the duration. Is that correct?
Yeah, so LOLE measures the number of days in which at least one outage occurs. There's another metric, LOLH, loss of load hours, that measures total number of hours. And in the report, I have 1 or 2 charts that show LOLH instead of LOLE.
Great, thank you. There's a question about the DECs, and I think it's mostly about how do DEC credits work? Is there a contractual requirement for it? Does this work like anything in other markets? Pat, you want to take that one? And again, kind of briefly, and then we can always have people follow up after.
Sure. So it really is designed in the same way as REC or RPS programs, which are more familiar. So under RPS, load serving entities have to buy a certain number of these credits, and renewable generators are granted those credits by virtue of generating power. So the DEC would work in the same way. The load serving entities would be required to purchase a certain number of credits from qualifying generators. But instead of renewables qualifying for these credits, it's going to be 2-hour batteries or very efficient, very fast start gas turbines.
Thank you for that. Anybody want to add anything briefly to that one? To the questions about will things be made available afterwards? Yes, we'll get everything out to folks that attended this webinar. There was the question about whether or not these findings will be shared with the PUC or ERCOT. Of course, these will be publicly available, but yes, I think, Allison, do you want to take that one?
Sure, we are, as we are sharing it with you, we are sharing these documents with the Public Utility Commission and with ERCOT, and with our friends in the legislature and elsewhere. And we'll be filing these in the various PUCT market design and reliability dockets. And the next piece of this that analyzes what if we're aggressive on energy efficiency and demand response, what does that do for reliability and costs? That piece also will be filed in the market design docket, but also in the energy efficiency docket.
So that one again will be coming in just a few weeks. Allison, looks like you wanted to answer the question from Mose here about wide range of uncertainty around LSEO cost. Research suggests DEC provides best bang for the buck.
I'm gonna start on that and let Pat do follow on and clean up. Yes, there's a wide range of uncertainty around LSEO costs. The one thing that is not uncertain, that is absolutely clear, is the LSEO costs are potentially huge. And as now the program is so significantly undefined, that there is no way to narrow in the parameter for how expensive it could be or how effective it could be at improving reliability. None of these measures will change reliability through 2025 or even possibly 2026. We are looking at, because only the stuff that is already in the queue and coming online can do that. And none of these programs will take effect except to create certainty after they have been adopted. So we don't expect any one of these measures to add resources in the short term, i.e. next 2 or 3 years. The biggest concern that we have about LSEO is that, as Pat illustrated with the impacts of different resource accreditation methods, it is extraordinarily easy to manipulate or game that program in a way that could significantly increase costs and that could significantly change the likelihood that those costs enrich current resources rather than add future resources. You are correct in concluding that we think the DEC provides the best bang for the buck, as does the backstop reliability service. DEC is more of a summer solution. BRS is more of a winter solution. We suspect that the PUC could probably implement both and save customers, improve reliability and save customers a bunch of money in comparison to the LSEO option. Pat, what did I miss?
I don't have a lot to add. I'll just reiterate one point that was made earlier very briefly, which is that the 3 programs to some extent aim at different things. The DEC really is focused on improving operational flexibility in the grid. It's not exclusively aimed at bringing online just megawatts. The LSEO is more aimed at bringing online megawatts. And so, as Allison mentioned, the DEC and the BRS are not really mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other because they're trying to solve different problems.
Thanks, Mose.
I would also just point out too that DECs look much more like to the point, just building on what Pat said there, that they are these sort of flexible like operation resources. It would help a lot in the summertime, not that it wouldn't help in the winter, but the BRS would be much more geared towards the winter. Pat, do you want to say anything about just sort of like summer versus winter challenges briefly?
Sure, and yeah, they're not exclusive. I mean, both would bring on resources that wouldn't be there otherwise, and they would be there in summer and winter as risks arise. It's just that the nature of risks is different in summer and winter. So winter risks are caused by much greater uncertainty in demand, as seen during ERI, for example. When temperatures go down, the demand rises massively compared to an expected case. And in summer, the demand can rise a bit compared to the expected case, but not as much. Winter, there's also greater uncertainty with respect to renewable output and overall resource availability. Allison mentioned issues with gas. That's even a further topic out there. So net of all of that is risks in winter center on extreme weather and often are longer duration. And you've seen this. ERI was almost a week-long event. The outages back in 2011 were for 5 or 6 hours, and risks in summer are much more concentrated on the afternoon to early evening. So it's a short duration of risk. It's caused by different factors. And the reason that the programs have different impacts is that 2-hour batteries are quite effective in summer because the risk is concentrated in a short period of hours. And in winter, that's less true. And so there's less effectiveness there compared to the BRS.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Also, from a consumer perspective, let's be really clear that, as Uri proved, the consequences of a long outage in winter is far more disastrous for human health, for human comfort, for economic well-being. Whereas, it's not fun, but we can all survive a 1 or 2 rolling hour outage in the summertime. Very few summer outages turn out to be long events, but winter outages, the human consequences are significantly greater, and therefore the risk is much higher of a significant outage.
There was a quick question here to clarification. Wholesale power costs now without any of these changes is about 25 billion annually. It of course varies dependent on, weather and all sorts of things, but that's about right, Pat, 25 billion?
I think that's about right, yeah, for total costs. I'll throw out one other uncertainty factor is in natural gas prices. This has a certain natural gas price forecast baked into it, and those prices have been super volatile. So that is another source of cost uncertainty, but that would affect pretty much all of the programs. But yes, about 25 billion.
All right, let's see. So I think we got to most of them. Panelists, were there other questions that you saw? There's a lot of questions, and thank you very much for everybody for being so participatory and asking these questions. I of course did not get all of them, but panelists, was there anything else that you wanted to address?
A couple things. One of them is Mark Watson says the link doesn't work through Zoom. We will send that out to everybody in follow-up. As I said, we will send you the link to the report and the TCA fact sheet and a link to this webinar, which will be recorded in case those of you who are on electronic media want to get Pat or Josh saying smart things. You can clip from the webinar to put that on air tonight or at your convenience. So we will send you all of that as a follow-on email. We have a question from Jeff Blazinski. Hope I said your name right, Jeff. LSCO will solve reserve margin, but not operations flexibility. DEC will solve flexibility. It will improve reserve margins, but will do much more for flexibility. But while it improves reserve margins, it will also, while it solves flexibility, DEC will also increase reserve margins slightly. And as Pat said in his findings, DEC could actually save us money because of the nature of those, which is a phenomenal outcome. We think that we concluded that the best way to solve this from among the available options, if they have to do something, it would be better to do both DEC and BRS with some very strict additional checks and precautions that are outlined in the summary. Jeff also asks, is there one program that solves both? And to that I want to answer, stay tuned for the energy efficiency portfolio report, because we suspect that an aggressive energy efficiency and demand response programs for all Texans will do much more for affordability and reliability than most of these measures. And if we did these on top of aggressive energy efficiency and reliability, it would solve a lot of both affordability and reliability measures challenges. Josh, what you got?
Yeah, I just think also in terms, it's kind of those are the most straightforward. Like those two, they're the most transparent, most straightforward programs. It's like, and particularly about kind of leaving the kind of the core of the market as we start to add capacity and stuff. I probably just need to do a whole bunch more stuff than do just some like band-aids on it. But those two programs, I do think, kind of add a bit of they add a bit of help while also not making things so overly complex that it's easy to game or hard to follow. So that was just going to be my kind of point on your point.
I don't know if we've actually said, it is obviously in the report and you can see it there, and you see it sort of in some of the slides, but some of the scale compared to the others, it might get lost. DEC is really interesting, and somebody made this point in the Q&A. The dispatchable energy credits are meant to be in the market, and so they actually do they actually return costs to customers, and that adds up. So in the first few years, there's a cost to customers to implement DECs. Once they get going, from 2027 to 2030, there's an average savings to the market and to customers of $2 billion per year. So that is something we don't see in either of the other proposals. There's really no chance, because they're just programs that cost, that they could actually return to customers, and the model does show that would happen. I am going to just answer one more question, and then I'll ask the panelists if you have any final thoughts before we end. And of course, I'm sure all our audience, we will get them the materials afterwards. Sorry if any links aren't working. There was this question about what is the timeline for the PUC to make a final decision on phase 2. Thanks for that question, Jeff. That is a bit opaque right now. There is on the PUC website, if you look on their calendar, there is a meeting called Market Design Meeting on January 12th. It is possible that they will want to make a decision then, though I don't know that. I don't believe they've said that definitively, but it is interesting that all the other meetings are listed as open meeting and that one's listed as market design meeting. It's also interesting that that's 2 days after the legislature convenes. So if they do make a decision, that would of course be the PUC making decision just as the legislature comes in, which would be remarkable for a number of reasons. Timeline is unclear, but I think it is safe to say that there are some in the market that would like for this change to be made very quickly. This change meaning the LSEO being adopted for implementation somewhere around 2025. There are those that would like to have that adopted quickly without a lot of or any legislative input. So important note on the timeline. All right, panelists, is there anything else you'd like to say before we end?
The PUC has committed that they will not adopt anything. Why they will make a policy decision, but they will not implement it until after the legislature approves it.
Thank you, Allison. Josh or Pat, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Just that I'm proud of this report, and hopefully, and happy to see it make a add to the discussion about how we make the grid in Texas better.
Nothing for me, Doug. I'm happy. There's a few other questions that are sitting out there. I'm happy to follow up with folks. My email is listed on the report, so please get in touch with me. I'm always available.
I hope folks will take Pat up on that. Go ahead, Allison.
And we appreciate y'all paying attention to this important issue. We think this is a pretty terrific report, and I want to again compliment and thank the ICF team for their great work on this. And we hope that you all will not only pay attention to this, use this as a side-by-side with the PUC's analyses when those come out, because they will offer probably different viewpoints and different perspectives. And it's important to consider all of them when you are reporting on something as important as ERCOT reliability and the zillions of dollars of costs that we face as ratepayers and customers and consumers. And I hope that you will pay almost as much attention to the energy efficiency chunk of this report when it comes out in a few weeks.
Pay more attention to energy efficiency.
Yes, please.
Yes, I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you, Allison, Pat, and Josh. Thank you, Pat, also to the ICF team. There's a really important contribution to a really important discussion. We will follow up with those in the press that have questions after this. And we thank you for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedules. And we'll go ahead and end there. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.